Following video was recorded on stolen Aboriginal land. CEDA acknowledges the first people of the land on which we live and work and pay our respects to elders past and present and emerging.
My name is Bryson and I'm the co-facilitator for Queer Peers at CEDA. My pronouns are he, him. Well, I actually knew about CEDA when it first launched. Went along to a planning cafe, wasn't feeling great about the NDIS at that point, so I didn't really continue engaging, but I was still on the mailing list. And then I found out about Queer Peers, and I got their details and joined, and then I linked up with Shaylee and Sinead and Owen, and and through that I, started coming to Queer Peers meetings, met some of the other people at CEDA, found out about what it was like from the inside, and I was like, oh, this is a super cool organisation, and then not long after that I was asked to be co-facilitator for Queer Peers, so that's pretty cool. Becoming part of CEDA has been really good because, it's been a really big part in me finding pride in my identity as a disabled person. I was definitely starting that journey already, but I think CEDA has accelerated it and enabled me to find community and in ways that I hadn't previously done. What was life growing up as a queer disabled person? It was hard. I'm not visibly disabled, so I often felt really lonely because I didn't feel represented. All the representation of disability I was seeing around me were people with really visible disabilities, so I felt really lonely and not represented. And this was in the 90s and early 2000s. I remember one time there was an episode of Wild Thornberrys, and there was a character with crutches, and that was a big deal. But yeah, largely I didn't feel represented, and then at my school there was a special ed department, but I wasn't in the special ed department, so I was the disabled kid, but I didn't have any friends who were, so it was just very very isolating and very difficult. Growing up as queer, that was also really difficult, early, in the 90s I wasn't old enough to start thinking of myself as queer, but early 2000s it was very much in the time where gay was an insult, and there was no representation of bisexuality. I'm bi, so I was when I started to figure out I was queer, I was well, I have no idea what to call myself, because I know I'm not 100% gay and I'm not 100% straight, and that was really tough because bisexuality was just not talked about. My parents would be oh, it's fine if you're gay. I was okay, but I'm not gay. I remember trying to come out to my dad once and telling him I thought I might be gay, and he was well, I don't think you are, because I've seen how you are with people of the opposite gender, and you've talked about having crushes on people of the opposite gender, so I don't think you're gay. And that conversation happened when I was 14, and then that shut me down for 3 more years of trying to figure out who I was and trying to figure out coming out. And then when I eventually did come out and I said I was bi, my family responded with oh, we always thought you were gay. I was I'm not gay, I'm literally telling you with my mouth that I'm bi. So that was hard in terms of the bi representation. And then at my school, in my year group, I was the closest thing to an openly queer person, and I still wasn't even openly queer. It was more an open secret because I looked gay. And so people just were well, we guess Bryson's gay. And yeah, so that was hard, and um, yeah, and like I'm a trans guy as well, so that adds another level to it because uh, like being a trans kid, not having any representation, not having any language, you know, and there are just so many parallels with growing up queer and growing up disabled as well. Like I think they feed into each other as well, you know. Yeah, so queer peers changes things, I guess, by like, you know, um, I think, you know, we're still at a place with disability identities where, you know, a lot of it's rooted in shame. And I still think that's the case with queerness, but I think there's been like a real active, obviously pride exists, you know, and ability to like talk about like your disability experience as like just as worthy of celebration and affirmation, and you know, incorporating in your identity and your understanding, your experience of yourself as queerness is. Um, like, yeah, I think that's what's changed the game for me, is being part of queer peers, is like um, being able to see those two parts of my identity as equally worthy of pride and celebration and affirmation and core to my identity. Like, you know, because since I've figured out I was queer, I've deeply understood it and celebrated it as core to my identity. It's taken longer to feel that way about being disabled, but I think being part of queer peers, you know, allows that to happen. It allows us to experience our disabilities as just as, yeah, celebrated and, you know, core to who we are as our queerness. You know, and I think queer peers, you know, is a fantastic space because, you know, like we make jokes about our experiences, we, you know, swap tips and tricks, we kind of like, you know, it's a space where we can like just exist as who we are. And um, you know, I mean, a couple of meetings ago there was just this like great exchange between like a couple of members where like one of the autistic members was just like, what's everybody's special interests, and like everyone just went off on like a discussion about that, and it was like this real moment of like, you know, like solidarity and celebration. And you know, and then we had someone that like wanted tips about like wheelchairs, and like people were just giving advice, and I was just thinking like, this is amazing, and this is like a space where where people are, you know, sharing experiences and like, you know, feeling empowered. And those words get so overused, but it was like a genuine sense of like, you know, sitting there watching it and watching like the members making connections. And we had a member that had only just come out as queer, didn't even realize that their identity was part of the queer umbrella, until like 2 weeks before, and I told them about queer peers and they came along, and like it was, and like I wasn't sure how they'd go because they were quite shy, but they like took to it, and I was just like, this is such a privilege to watch, and it made me so proud to be part of it. And yeah, and you know, this person had kind of said, oh, I've like never met another person with like my identity before, and I was like, well mate, like I know so many, like come along, like, you know. And you know, this person almost had the opposite experience to me, where they were really proud of their disability identity but hadn't really experienced their queer identity, so almost the opposite of me. And then to watch them come into the space and watch them like, you know, like find community and stuff was just like, you know, I guess if you think about how does it change the dialogue, I think it really shifts it from like shame based and deficit based, and you know, you watch people come together and they are able to experience and talk about the confluence and intersection, of their identities and experiences, and see them as equally worthy of celebration and affirmation. So for Counterscene, queer peers are holding a queer and disability trivia night where we are inviting members of both those communities and people who experience an intersection of those communities to come along and participate in trivia that is specifically about both queer and disability culture, which is super exciting. And yeah, we were really specific about it because initially we were just like, oh, well, we could just do a trivia night. And then after further discussion, we were like, well, this is actually an opportunity to, like, provide some education, provide some culture, provide some history for people. Because yeah, we kind of thought, well, we could run just a trivia night, like whenever, whereas this obviously being specifically part of Counters In, we have a real opportunity to kind of like, incorporate our identities and our experiences as part of the event. And then the queer aspect on top of that, it's like, well, let's, because queer disabled people are so invisible. I was saying earlier, particularly like queer people with intellectual disabilities, it's like there's this assumption that like, they don't know who they are, I think that's, true for all disabled people, but particularly people with intellectual disabilities. And so, for me, and I think for the rest of queer peers, I won't say I think, I know for the rest of queer peers, it is so important for us to have our queerness highlighted. And so, yeah, we were like, well, yeah, let's specifically make it queer and disability trivia. And then hopefully people will actually learn, as well as having a bit of fun, because who doesn't love a trivia night? People will also actually learn about our communities, or if they already know the stuff, like feel a sense of it being celebrated and valued and visible. Yeah. So I'm particularly hoping we get like younger people coming, maybe people who don't know as much about the queer history, queer culture, or disabled history and culture,